Hey there, James here at Penner Trailer Sales. I want to talk to you for a minute about hubs and bearings and how to keep them from breaking. From my experience, hub failure usually comes from two things: poor lubrication or poor bearing adjustment. As long as you have good lubrication and good bearing adjustment, hubs are pretty reliable. But when they fail, it can also be pretty tragic. Let you down in the worst time possible, and it can be a safety hazard as well. You could have a wheel take off on its own, and that's just not a good situation. So first of all, I'll talk about greased bearings, and then also touch a little bit on oil bearings. I have here, this is an 8K hub, 8K spindle to go with it, and then the bearings as well. If you're familiar with installing bearings, you'll know that a bearing comes new, it's dry. And if you're doing a greased, if this is going to be a greased bearing, you need to pack the bearing. Packing the bearing involves pressing grease into the rollers. Just filling and pushing grease into the hub isn't going to be sufficient because the grease isn't going to work its way into that bearing as it needs to. So you need to pack the bearing. This here, some of you may be familiar, this is a good old-fashioned bearing packer. You pop this green cap off, drop it in there, give it a good push, and it pushes the grease through the bearings. You can also do it with the palm of your hand. Quite messy, but it works well. Just dip out some grease in the palm of your hand and you'll wind up working it like so. And as you work it like so, you'll want to see the grease push out the other side. New axles, believe it or not, oftentimes when they assemble a new axle at a factory, all they do is they pack the bearing. They don't actually fill the hub with grease. They'll pack the bearing, they'll put it on the spindle and put it together. I've had an axle representative tell me that part of the reason they do that is the hub runs cooler when the hub is not filled with grease, because when it's filled with grease, there's grease shearing, as they call it, against itself, and it'll run a little warmer. But it's only a few degrees. It's not a big difference. This spindle here is not an Easy Lube spindle, unfortunately, but an Easy Lube spindle will have a grease zert in the end of the spindle, and that grease zert has a grease passage that is bored through the spindle, and it'll come out just in front of the seal here on the inner inside the inner bearing. So that grease will come through, and as you're pumping it from the outside, it'll flush the seal. If it holds, will flush the grease out to the outside. So when you see grease starting to come out through your outer bearing, then you know that your entire hub cavity has been filled. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, with my trailers, I maintain them that way. I'll give a few shots of grease out on the grease zert, and until I see some fresh grease coming through, and then I know I have plenty of grease in there. But it's amazing to me how long an axle or a hub can actually last with only the bearings being packed, because we see new axles that haven't been serviced. We take them apart, they have quite a few miles on them, and have been around for a number of years, and there's only grease in the bearing. So proper lubrication, and that kind of covers grease lubrication, is really key. This is a very common grease cap, and it's set up for Easy Lube. This little rubber plug just pops right out, and when you pop it out, you'll be able to see that. You'll be able to see your grease in there and your grease zert. When you add grease through that grease cap, you can kind of see as your grease comes through, or just looking in there even without adding any grease, what kind of condition your grease is. Do you have moisture in there? Is it breaking down? Is it really dirty? It's not uncommon for it to be pretty dark colored. You'll usually put in the fresh grease will be red grease. Red grease indicates high temp grease, and you want high temp grease because it gets a fairly high temperature running down the highway. So in high temp grease in there, if you have a marine axle, you want to use a green marine grease. Marine grease is usually green, and it is formulated so that water will not emulsify with the oils that's in the grease. So basically water won't break down the grease if it gets in there. And with marine axles, it's not uncommon for some moisture to get in your hub. So you just want to kind of keep tabs on the health of your grease in there and make sure there's plenty in there. With an oil bath axle, this is probably a 10 or a 12K oil bath cap, and obviously it's clear. Some are metal, and just this portion is a clear window, but there'll usually be a clear window where you can see, if it's an oil bath, you can visually see your oil level. And believe it or not, on this there's a ring, and that indicates the oil level. And so the oil level in this cap is down here, which is not much. It's really easy to overfill these. You want to fill them up to the center plug. And again, these here on the oil bath caps, the plugs seat a little more firmly, but it's easy to want to add it up to the bottom of the fill hole, which if you do that, it's going to weep out, it's going to drain, it's going to leak and make a mess when it's going down the road. So you only want to fill it up here to this line. Usually just some 80-90 weight oil, gear oil, is what you want to put in here. So again, also you kind of keep tabs, make sure there's not moisture in there, make sure there's enough, and make sure it's clean, just good lubrication quality. So that kind of covers good lubrication and keeping it lubricated. The next one, the next cause of failure is adjustment, bearing adjustment. And I'll demonstrate this here, probably for sake of demonstration. I'll take this seal off. But this is a spindle. The largest portion here, this is where the seal is going to fit on. And you'll see this kind of fits on there nice and snug. This is a grease seal, so the rubber lip here rides and turns on this seal surface. If this were a oil seals are designed differently in that when you slip it on here, the rubber inner lip does not turn against the spindle. Rather, the seal is designed that it actually turns inside of itself. So there's no, the seal's not riding on the spindle nor in the hub. It's actually designed to accommodate that turning action inside the seal itself. So here I've got the spindle with the bearings assembled inside of this hub. I've left the grease seal out. The grease seal would be a pound in, a press fit right here, and would seal again against this surface on the spindle. But I've left that off so you can see the inner bearing there. And then on the top side, I've got the outer bearing dropped in there with the castle nut. Now when we adjust this, I have this adjusted, and you're not going to be able to see it on the video, but essentially I just snugged up this nut until I had no play. And I can probably actually exaggerate this for you, but I've got several turns off of the nut. And see how we have play in the bearing? Perhaps you can see it on the inside here, fair amount of play. So if I twist that castle nut just a few turns, a third hand here, and that's probably 2 turns, maybe 2.5 turns, till it went snug. So now I'm snug, and I back it off just a little bit, and there's no perceptible play. I can actually feel just probably 1/1000th of an inch of play there, but it's nice and loose. If I were to tighten just by finger tight the spindle nut too much, there, it drags, doesn't spin nearly as free. And that's just tightening. If I were to put a wrench on there, it'd really get stiff. But if I back this off there again, that's probably 1/8 of a turn. The difference between too snug and then 1/8 of a turn looser, and it spins nice and freely. Some service manuals will give you a torque spec to initially torque this spindle nut to. So you put a torque wrench on there and set that spindle nut to a specific torque. That ensures that everything is all seated together, and then after you've reached that torque, then they'll tell you to back it off. And oftentimes it's not very scientific. They'll just say turn it until snug, and it's literally about it. It's turn it till snug, and so you know that it's able to spin freely, and you have very little to no play. If you happen to get no play, that's awesome. If it has just a little bit of play, that's okay. And you can see the spindle nut actually, it's not very fine, the adjustments. So right now it actually happens to be the hole is right on the nut, so I can't actually drop it in between the notch where it needs to be. So I'll need to back it up just a bit. That's enough to where I can feel a little bit more play, but not much, and it's still fine. And my cotter key here, then I would drop that in and bend that over to set that. As time goes on and this bearing would wear, you would need to open it up, take that pin, and then maybe tighten it 1 turn, or 1 notch rather, not 1 turn, 1 notch, and drop that cotter key back in, is how you can maintain your adjustment. Now, The times when the outer bearing is the bearing that gets the most wear, because it gets a tremendous amount of strain when you're turning the trailer and it's scrubbing. There's a lot of sideways pressure. And as that wears and becomes looser, what holds this bearing together is the keeper. And this keeper is pretty soft material. It's not very stout. But as long as the bearing is in proper adjustment, these rollers really don't want to go anywhere. They're pretty happy. They all have even pressure on them all the way around, and it'll spin happily for quite a few miles. If it gets too loose and there's a lot of play, then all of the weight will wind up only bearing on 2 rollers. And when it only bears on 2 rollers, then it's going to want to push those rollers apart from one another and start to eat at your retainer. And once your retainer fails, then your rollers are going to start dropping out of your bearing, and then you're going to have a failure. Catastrophic failure. You'll have lots of smoke, maybe a little fire, and perhaps an escaped wheel. So to avoid that, all you need to do is keep this bearing properly adjusted so it's seated in the race evenly all the way around. If it's not too loose, if it's too loose, you'll be looking at it like so, and all the weight will just be on 2 rollers at a time, and that's when things go downhill. So if you keep it properly adjusted, it'll sit in there real nice and happy, and you'll get quite a few miles and even years of use out of a bearing. In order to check this, what I do with my trailers, I'll just walk up to them. If the trailer is not loaded, doesn't have a lot of weight on it, you just grab the tire by the top and just shake it side to side. You'll feel or hear a little bit of movement in there, a little bit of a clunk clunk, and again, a little bit is fine, but if you've got a lot of movement, then you just want to open it up, or if you see that if you keep a static baseline, you kind of know about how much movement you have in there. Month or a year and a half later, you notice, you know what, this is getting to be a bit more movement than I had before. Pop that grease cap off, adjust that spindle nut, maybe another notch on the castle nut there, and you'll get back to the same minimal play that you had before, and you know that your bearings are happy, and you have pretty high level confidence if you have good lubrication and good adjustment that you won't have an unexpected bearing failure. So I hope that's helpful. If you have questions about your trailer, about your hubs and bearings, or if you need one fixed and serviced, we'd love to help you out. Give us a call here at Penner Trailer Sales, 931-361-1122.